Hi, this is the third part on consuming REST API with Dart and Flutter. In this part of the course, we're actually going to start using an API. Alright, so here we are in the API documentation for the API that we're going to use. Here we have a couple of sections, the one for the API key, which we will need in order to access our API. And we also have a notes section where we have all of our actions for our notes. So let me try getting a list of notes, clicking try it out, and clicking execute. And over here I will get a 401 response, which as it says over here means I am unauthorized. So in order to be authorized in every request, I need to send an API key. This is very common for a lot of APIs that need API keys. And if you don't need an API key, you most likely need some kind of an access token to authenticate yourself. So if you are following along with this course, in order to get the API key, you're going to go to the API key section, click on this get the API key action, and click on try it out, and just click execute. And here in the response body, you have an actual API key. We can copy this and go below to the node section, paste in the API key, clicking execute, and we have some nodes. So why do we have an API key in this very simple API? The thing here is, when I created the API, I wanted for every user to be able to have their own isolated nodes. So I didn't want one user to be able to interfere with the other user's nodes. So that's why we have an API key. And don't try to use this API key I have over here, just generate your own one in this request, because I'm going to delete this one once this course is published. So here we have some nodes as JSON. And if you have never worked with an API, you might be questioning what is JSON. Well, JSON is just a data format that lets us represent objects. So you may think of this little object as an instance of a node class. And the node class may have a property that's called node ID, and another one that's called node title, and a couple of date properties, which are create date time and latest added date time. So this is a very simple way for us to just express data and send them between an API and our application. Most APIs use JSON to send data. So these curly braces are used to represent an object, and these square brackets are used to represent an array. So here when I clicked on this execute, I got a list or an array, whichever one you might like, a list of these objects, and we might just call them node objects. If I copied an ID from a certain node, here we have a row that says nodes/node ID, and this is just so we can get a specific node. So we need to put in our node ID, but also we need to put in an API key in order to authorize ourselves. So let's just copy the API key from here and put it in over here and click execute. And now you may see that we did not get an array, but we got an actual node. And it has an additional property called node content. So let me kind of explain what these requests are actually about. We have a couple of these request methods, which are get, post, put, and delete. Get is basically used for getting a resource. You're not sending anything to the API except if you want to authorize yourself, or you want to say, hey, I want this and this resource. Even if you send some data, that data is about getting something from the API. Then you have a post request. Post request is used mostly when creating something in the API. And in the post method, you send a request body. And over here, we're sending a body that's going to represent some kind of a node that's going to have a node title and a node content. And what happens when I send this body, the API will validate the data I sent. So if I send something that is not valid, the API will tell me. But if I send valid data, it's going to be created in the API in whichever way, mostly just saved in the database. And the API will let me know that I have created that resource successfully. Then there is the next method, which is the put method. The put method is similar to post, but with the put method, you are actually updating a resource. When we're sending a post request, there is no node to change. But when we're doing a put request, we're actually saying, I'm sending some data in order to update a node with node ID, 1. So the put request is basically used for updating data. And with the put request, you send some kind of JSON body to completely update a resource. So I need to send both the title and the content, and it's going to override both the title and the content inside that node with the new data that I send it. I'm telling you this because there's an additional method for updating data, and that's patch. And with a patch request, we can update just the node title and just the node content. But the patch method is a little more complicated for beginners, and that's why I'm leaving it out of this course. I may have it as a bonus video in the future. And then we have the delete method. It's pretty self-explanatory. We're pointing to a certain node with our node ID value, and we're saying I want to delete this node. With this little explanation of a couple of these methods, we pretty much went over the HTTP methods themselves. And if you haven't figured out, HTTP methods are just there to describe what the API is supposed to do, or what we are supposed to do. When you go to google.com, you're actually sending a GET request to google.com and saying to Google, hey, give me this web page. And Google sends back HTML and CSS and JavaScript, and then your browser renders it. And here, when I say get me a list of nodes, it sends me raw JSON data that I then decode in my app, and then I show it in a nice way. So that's pretty much all there is to it. Of course, there are also additional HTTP methods, but we're not going to mention them, since when you're working with an API from a mobile app, you're mostly going to just encounter get, post, put, delete, and sometimes patch. Alright, so now I want to explain the concept of status codes. So when we send a GET request to the API, here we get a response. And here we get a status code, which is 200. And then we have a response body and we have response headers, which we'll get into a little bit later. So what is a status code? A status code is basically the server letting us know if our request succeeded or failed. And there are a lot of status codes. One of the more common ones are 200, which is just the request was successful, and if there is a result, it's included in the body. And since we're getting a list of nodes, here it says 200, which means successful, and we have a result, and it's in the response body. Then we have a status code of 201. And that status code basically means you have successfully created a resource. And that is returned in 99.9% of cases by the post request. So here we are going to send our API key as always, and we're going to create a node. Let's just call it test node, and just some node content ABC. So now what we're doing with our post request is we're sending just some raw JSON data and saying execute, and we get some kind of a response. And over here we got 201. And 201, as I said, means that we have created a resource. And what most of the APIs will do once you successfully create a resource, they will also include the resource itself as the response body. So that can tell you if your node was successfully created, successfully represented, or whatever. And then we have a status code that we have encountered ourselves just a couple of minutes ago. If I remove the API key and click send or execute, I will get a 401. And 401 means that I am unauthorized. It means that I am not a valid user, so I cannot do X, Y, or Z. So you may get that if you don't send the API key. Or in some more complex APIs, if you don't send an access token, you will also get a 401. Alright, so since we have explored a couple of status codes, let me actually go to the documentation that was written by Mozilla that is very good for explaining status codes, so we can look more in depth into this thing. Alright, so here we are on that documentation, if you may, and here they broke up the status codes into a couple of categories. The first one is informational responses, which are from 100 to 199. And personally, I have never encountered these when working with an API, so we're not even going to look at them. Then we have successful responses. This is pretty much what we talked about, 200, 201. One popular one is 204, but we'll look at that in a minute. The next one is redirects. And I personally have never encountered this also when working with an API, and these ones are pretty common for web pages. So we have from 400 to 499, those are client errors. These are actually very common when working with an API because mostly is when you miss a certain field, or you're supposed to send an email and you don't send it in an email format or something like that. So the server will let you know exactly what you messed up. And also in this category is the 401 response we encountered, which is also a client error because the client didn't send the required information to authorize himself. And then the fifth one, we have server errors. This is kind of opposite from the client errors. There is an error, but you cannot really do anything about it unless you can go and fix the API yourself. That's when something crashes on the server or something happens on the server that's not supposed to happen, and the server just sends you back a 500 response. Alright, so now let's go and take a look at a couple of status codes. So here we have the 200 OK response, and it says over here the request has succeeded, and the meaning of the success depends on the HTTP method, of course. And for the get method, it's the resource has been fetched and is transmitted in the message body, and this is mostly where you will encounter a 200 response. So we have 201 created. This is when you create a resource, we already talked about it. Then we have 204 no content. This one is pretty much the same as 200, but it does not return anything in the body. Alright, so yeah, there is not anything more important here. Then we have client errors, 400 bad request. This is when we mess something up, when we set a bad JSON file to the server or something like that. Then we have 401 unauthorized, we already explained this one. Then we have 403 forbidden. The 403 forbidden is actually very similar to the 401. The only difference is that 403 is actually authenticated as a valid user, but that specific user does not have the permission to do the certain action that he wants to do. Then we have 404 not found. So this one you mostly encountered even when you were just browsing the web. You try to go to some link and there is nothing on there, it just says 404 or it says this does not exist and whatever. And also it says over here, this response code is probably the most famous one. So yeah, this basically means that a certain resource does not exist. This may also mean that you have tried to hit a invalid URL. So if in this API you try to hit notes with 2 E's in it, and that would return a 404. That does not mean that a resource does not exist. This just means that an API does not have that endpoint. But what is also very interesting is what it says over here. It says servers may also send this response instead of 403 to hide the existence of a resource from an unauthorized client. So this is actually very common, and I have used this myself when developing APIs. So if you return a 403 to a client, you basically tell him, hey, this resource exists, somebody else can access it, but you cannot. And a lot of times it's just better to hide it with a 404, just pretend like it does not exist. Then, I don't know if we have here anything that important. No, and here we have 500 internal server error, and we already explained this one. Server messed up, you cannot do anything about it. So yeah, that's pretty much it for the status codes. If I haven't bored you to death with all of these explanations, let's actually go to Visual Studio Code and try to consume this API. Alright, so here we are in our main application, and we need to go to pubspec.yaml. And that is because we need to install a certain package that's going to help us work with HTTP requests. So here I am on the pub dev page, and this is documentation for the HTTP package. And this is a third-party HTTP package, but it's really developed by the Flutter community, so it kind of has a stamp of approval by Google and the Flutter team and whatever. So this is actually a very stable package to use. So we can go down here and install this dependency. by just going over here and importing it. And now let me just save the file, and Flutter packages get is going to install by itself. A reason we're using an external HTTP package is because Dart has a way of working with HTTP requests like built in, but with this HTTP package it's just a lot more simple and clean and whatever. So if you remember my last video, I said that we're going to replace this hard-coded data with an actual HTTP call. So that's what we're going to do right now. So the first thing I'm going to do is delete this data and actually make this into a future. Since HTTP requests are asynchronous, we need to use futures. If you're not familiar with futures, check out the video in the cards, it will explain everything you need to know. And here we're returning a list of notes for listing, but what I usually like to do with my applications is have a class called API Response. And in the API Response class, I have the data about the data basically that was returned from the response. I also have information about any errors that were returned. And I like to have that as kind of a standardized way on how I work with things. This will all make a lot more sense once I implement this and show you what I mean. So let me go to the models directory and create a new file called API Response. And in here we are going to create a class that's going to be called API Response. And we're going to put into this API Response class a generic type parameter. And this type parameter is basically going to be the type of the body that was returned from the API. So now the first property is going to be the data itself that was returned from the API. And that's going to be of the type T, which is the generic type we have over here. The second property is going to be for a boolean that's going to represent if the server returned an error or not. And the third property is going to just have the error message if an error was returned. So yeah, now let me create a constructor that's going to help us actually, well, construct this object once we want to use it. So here we have the constructor. It takes in this data as an optional parameter, and it also takes in an error as an optional parameter. So in the most cases, hopefully we won't have any errors, so the error parameter is by default false. So now I'm just going to cut this list of note for listing and say that this is of type API Response. And if you remember, this API Response can also take in a generic type parameter, and there is where we're going to put our list of note for listing. Alright, so now we can execute the actual HTTP request. I'm going to import the HTTP library and I'm going to give it an alias of HTTP. And now we can execute all of our HTTP requests. So if you remember from our API documentation, when we want to get a list of nodes, we use a GET request on a nodes path. So we're going to do return http.get. And in here we need to put in the URL of the API. So the URL of the API is this. So I'm just going to copy it and create a static constant variable that's going to say API. And I'm going to put it in like this. And now I'm just going to combine this API variable with /nodes. And that is this path to a node list action. But you may remember when we started out this video, if we don't send the API key, we will get a 401 response. So we need to send an API key as a header, because all of this stuff over here, they are headers as it says over here. And the header basically is some small data you're sending the API about the request or you're trying to authorize as a user. And what you may have also noticed is when a server sends a response, it also sends some headers. It says, I don't know, what was the server, it says what's the content type, and over here we can see it's JSON, when the request was sent, and whatever. So we can also send some headers, and for us it's going to be the API key. So let me copy the API key, and in order to represent a header that's going to work with this HTTP package, we will use a standard map. So over here we'll say API key, and we'll just put in the API key we generated at the start of the video. So now we can just say headers, and as you can see over here, it says that it needs to be a map of string and string, and this is exactly what this is. So let's just say headers. Alright, so this http.get should return a future of response. But now we need to convert that response to our API response of list of nodes for listing. So let's say then, which is just going to be a handler for our HTTP response. And here I'll say data. So now this body will execute once our HTTP request returns an actual response. So now the first thing we should do is add a check to see if our request was successful. We can just say if data.status code is equal to 200, 200 being the successful response status code. Alright, so now we need to convert the response body that we get over here to an actual Dart object that is list of node for listing. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to convert a raw body, which is just a string, to a map, and then we're going to convert that map to an actual Dart object. And the way we're going to do that is using a couple of helper packages that are built into Dart. So let me declare a variable called JSON data, and I'll just type JSON.decode, and what this method does is it takes in a raw string and converts it either into a map or a list of maps. So in our case, it's going to convert it into a list of maps. So we need to pass in the raw body, and it's located at data.body. So now we have our data as a list of maps. So now we need to convert this list of maps into an actual list of real objects. So we're going to do this by declaring a variable that's going to be called nodes, and this is going to be a list of node for listing, right? Hopefully this works. No, I'm stupid. Yeah, this will work. And now we are going to iterate over this JSON data list, and we're going to convert every single element into a node for listing, and then we're going to put all of those elements into this nodes list. So let me just show you what I mean. We're going to iterate over every single item in our JSON data list, and now we need to create a node for listing, and let's just say final node. And our node for listing takes a couple of parameters. The first one is the node ID. So it's item at node ID. So as we said, we have a list of maps, which is JSON data. And then we take an item, which is an individual map. And the way we access a value of some kind of a map property is by this operator. And we just put in the name of the property. Since we know that the name of these properties in an object are node ID, we just put in the node ID over here. And now we want to get the node title, and we see what the node title is in the raw JSON body. Copy that, come in over here. Then we have create date time, and this one is going to be a little bit more tricky because create date time over here is a date time object, and create date time over here is just a string representing date time. So we will have to say date time dot parse and then pass in our item from the API. Then we have latest edit date time, and we'll do the exact same thing we did for our create date time. Alright, but if we just leave this like this, we will get an error. And that's because, as you can see, this latest edit date time is null. And when we pass null into this datetime parse method, our app is going to crash. So we need to say if our latest datetime is not equal to null, then we'll do this. But if it is equal to null, then we'll just return null. So what I did over here is a shortened if statement saying if latest datetime is null, if latest datetime is not equal to null, then we're going to parse that exact thing. But if it is equal to null, then we'll just set this property to null. So yeah, and now what we need to do is add this node to our nodes list. Now let's go down here and return our API response. And I'll just give this a type parameter that we need just to keep this as explicit as possible and as clear as possible. And in here we're going to put in data, which is our notes, and error is false, so we don't need to put it in because it's false by default. But what I forgot to do in the API response constructor, I forgot to add a error message. So let me just do that right now. All right. So now we have covered the case when our HTTP request returns success. But if it does not return 200, then we can just return a standard API response with the list notes for listing, with data being nothing, but the error being true. Since we don't know what the error is, we'll just say error message and error occurred. But if you're familiar with futures, you know that they also have a catch error method. And that's if anything happens during the HTTP requests that makes the request basically throw an error. So what we're going to do there is also we're going to return an API response having an error. So let me just remove a couple of these things. Now we can start using this method in our note list page. So let me go to our views, note list. And now, since this is not a synchronous method anymore, we need to add a couple of little changes to it. So I'm going to remove the notes property and remove this quote-unquote API call. And I'm going to add a property that's going to represent the API response so that we know to show an error if we need to show one. And I'll just import the API response class. Let me just move this up there. And also I'm going to add a variable for loading. So because this is an asynchronous call, it's going to take some time to load all the notes. So we need to know whether or not we need to show a loading indicator. So I'll just put in a variable that says is loading. Right, and now in init state, I'm just going to call a method called patchnotes, which does not exist quite yet. But now we're going to create it immediately. And we're going to make this an async method. And now let's first set the state of our loading to be equal to true. And also at the end of the method, let's set our loading to be equal to false. And then in the middle, we'll say API response is equal to await, because we are awaiting a future. We're going to say service dot get notes list. So what we have done just over here, when our page is started up, we call a method fetch notes. And the fetch notes method basically makes us show the loading indicator, and then it gets the data that it needs from an API, and then it hides the loading indicator. So now let's actually implement this in the UI. So the first thing we should have, I think, is kind of an if statement to say if we're loading, then that means that we need to show a circular progress indicator. And if we're not loading, that means that we need to show our list view. And now we need to replace all of these notes with API response dot notes. Actually, it's not dot notes, but dot data. But now what if we get an error? We're not going to see the error, but we're going to try to just show the data. And you're right, so I'm actually going to scrap this and I'm going to use a builder widget. So I'm going to cut all of this stuff for the list view. Wait, I messed up. Cut this, and I'm just going to say builder, and we'll have a builder function that has our context, and we'll return our list view separated. So what the builder widget does is it basically makes it a little simpler for us to display data based on some kind of state we have in our page. So instead of writing all of these short if statements, we can just write normal if statements by saying if is loading, then we can return a loading indicator. But if response error, then that means we need to show text that needs to display an error message and some kind of stuff like that. So yeah, that's pretty much all the builder widget does. We're not just putting a single widget, but we have a builder function that lets us do some more complex logic more expressively. We technically could do this with all the inline if statements, but it would just be ugly and unreadable. But like this, I can immediately see if we're loading, then show a loading indicator. If we have an error, display the error. And if nothing of that is true, just display my list. So I hope that makes sense. I'm going to go to my application, restart the app. And so here we got, I don't know if you could see, a very short loading, and we got an error occurred. So we need to see what that is about. Alright, so after a little of debugging, I saw that I made a typo. So as you can see over here, it says create date time. But if I go back to the application, I here use created date time. So I should just go create date time, and this should hopefully fix all of our problems. Right, so we got some more issues. We tried to use our latest edit date time to format basically the date, but we could not do it because our latest edit date time is null. So we need to protect against that too. So we can just say if our latest edit date time is null, then we'll just use the create date time. And just save this. And yeah, we got all of our notes. We got even the one that we created ourselves. So yeah, now let me just restart the app for one more time to make sure. We get a loading indicator and we get our notes. So what I should do is actually center these notes. Not notes, but the loading indicator. And the next part, we're going to see how to add an interceptor in order to automatically add an authorization header to every single one of our requests.